Imagine standing on the deck of a massive ocean liner, feeling the wind rip across your face, the smell of salt in your lungs, and thinking, for a brief moment, that the world outside is as ordinary as it's ever been. Now imagine that under your feet are thousands of souls, not tourists, not crew, but men, women, and children who've already survived unimaginable horrors. And then, without warning, everything turns into a nightmare you couldn't have imagined even in your darkest dreams. That's the story of the Cap Arcona, a ship whose sinking became one of the deadliest maritime disasters in history, and yet, for decades, it remained virtually unknown outside Germany. Before we plunge into this tragic tale, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Hit the like button, share it with anyone who loves history, and let's make sure stories like this aren't forgotten. It was late April 1945. The Third Reich was crumbling. Berlin was encircled by Soviet forces. Hitler was dead, and the remaining Nazi leaders were desperately trying to manage the chaos of defeat. On the Baltic Sea, a fleet of ships gathered in the Lübeck Bay, their purpose unclear to most observers. Among them was the Cap Arcona, a luxury liner that had been repurposed in wartime. Once a symbol of opulence, now it carried the weight of despair. Tens of thousands of prisoners from concentration camps, primarily Neuengamme, but also from other camps, were crammed into the hold. The Nazis, in their final days, had loaded these ships not for safety, but as part of a plan that remains shrouded in horrifying ambiguity. The Cap Arcona was massive, nearly 200 meters long, originally designed to carry vacationers in comfort and luxury. Its interiors were elegant, with polished wood, spacious cabins, and dining halls meant for gala dinners. But in April 1945, those halls were filled with ragged men and women, sick and starving, many barely able to walk. Families were separated. People huddled in corners, praying quietly, holding on to one another for warmth and courage. Outside, the seas were deceptively calm, as if nature itself were mocking the terror aboard. The prisoners had no idea where they were going. Some thought liberation might be near. They could hear rumors that the war was ending. Others feared the worst, knowing that the Nazis were retreating, but not necessarily surrendering the lives they had held captive. On deck, guards moved among the prisoners with rifles, shouting orders. The tension was electric. Every small sound, a shout, a cough, the scrape of boots, felt amplified in the thick air of fear and uncertainty. And then there was the sea itself. For most of the prisoners, the Baltic was unfamiliar and terrifying. They had already endured starvation, forced labor, beatings, and disease. Now, confined to the hold of a ship, they could hear the water lapping against the hull, rhythmic and relentless, as if it were a countdown they could not stop. Allied forces were in the area. British planes patrolled the skies, unaware of the prisoners aboard. Orders were clear. Enemy vessels are targets, no exceptions. The Cap Arcona was listed among these targets, marked as a ship of the Third Reich, yet no one had informed the pilots of the human cargo hidden within. In a cruel twist of fate, thousands of innocents were aboard a vessel that would be mistaken for a legitimate military target. Accounts from survivors tell of panic that began even before the first bombs fell. Men and women scrambled toward open decks, only to be pushed back by armed guards or pressed into the hold by sheer crowding. Many were too weak to run, too sick to move. Some prayed aloud, others screamed in terror. The officers on board were frantic, issuing orders that made little sense, their voices drowned by the chaos. At roughly mid-afternoon on May 3, 1945, the first waves of attack began. RAF Typhoons, flying low over the Baltic, released rockets and bombs on the flotilla. Flames erupted along the decks. Smoke choked the air. The water, which moments before had seemed peaceful, became a mirror reflecting the sky set in blaze. Chaos became absolute. Those who could jump into the sea did so, only to find that the cold, rough waters were no sanctuary. Others were trapped below deck, crushed in the panic, burned or suffocated. And yet amidst this horror, acts of humanity still appeared. Prisoners helped one another escape from the holds. Men lifted children over railings. Women held on to the sick, guiding them toward whatever hope existed. One survivor later described crawling through the chaos, helping an older man who had collapsed, whispering reassurances even as the explosions rocked the ship. She said, "We were terrified, but we could not abandon one another. That was all we had left."
The Cap Arcona listed heavily, the fire spreading from bow to stern. Lifeboats, few and overcrowded, were launched, though many capsized immediately in the frantic, crowded water. Hundreds, perhaps thousands, were swept beneath the surface before anyone could grasp the full scale of the disaster. The screams, the cries for loved ones, the desperate thrashing of limbs in the cold sea. Accounts are almost too much to bear. Yet it is crucial to remember these voices, because they are the heart of this story, the human cost behind the historical facts. By nightfall, the Cap Arcona had sunk. Thousands had perished in the flames and waters of the Baltic. The sea was littered with debris and bodies, and the survivors clung to anything that floated, shivering and praying. The RAF pilots, returning to their base, had no idea they had struck a ship filled with concentration camp survivors. Their logs list enemy vessels destroyed, but they could not have known the tragedy they had inadvertently caused. In the aftermath, survivors were rescued by German civilians and soldiers, though resources were scarce. Medical aid was minimal, and many who were pulled from the water died in the following hours or days. Those who survived faced yet another challenge. The end of the war had come, but the physical and emotional scars would linger for a lifetime. It is said that for decades, the Cap Arcona disaster was almost forgotten in the shadow of other wartime tragedies. Unlike the Titanic, which became a symbol of human hubris, or the sinking of the Lusitania, which altered geopolitical landscapes, the Cap Arcona's story remained hidden, a footnote in the broader chaos of the final months of World War II. Perhaps it was because it reflected not heroism or glory, but pure tragedy, compounded by miscommunication and human error. Even today, historians struggle to piece together the full scale of the disaster. Estimates suggest that more than 7,000 people died aboard the Cap Arcona alone, making it one of the deadliest maritime disasters in recorded history. Yet, unlike other tragedies, it was compounded by moral ambiguity. The question of who was responsible is not clear-cut. The Nazis had packed prisoners onto ships, potentially to hide evidence of camps or to prevent their liberation. The Allies were unaware of the human cargo, and nature, indifferent as ever, added its own cruelty through the icy waters of the Baltic. Before we continue deeper into the horror and heroism of that fateful day, take a moment to subscribe if you haven't already. Hit the like button, share this with someone who appreciates the stories of human resilience amidst catastrophe, because the story of Cap Arcona is one that deserves to be remembered, not just as a statistic, but as a testament to the fragility and bravery of human life. The sinking of the Cap Arcona is not just about numbers. It's about people, the thousands who faced unimaginable fear, the guards who watched helplessly, the pilots who unknowingly sealed a fate. And in those moments, both tragedy and humanity collided in a way that leaves an indelible mark on history. As the sun climbed higher on May 3, 1945, the chaos aboard the Cap Arcona and the other ships in the flotilla became nearly incomprehensible. Smoke choked the air, the screams of the dying carried across the calm Baltic waters, and the frantic thrashing of bodies in the cold sea made it almost impossible for anyone to find footing or safety. Yet, amid the terror, stories of courage and selflessness emerged. People doing everything they could to save strangers, lifting children, supporting the elderly, even as fire and metal threatened to swallow them all. One survivor, a young man named Heinz, remembered crawling over the deck to rescue a woman who had fallen from the railing. Her hands were raw, bleeding, and her eyes wide with panic. He later recalled that he didn't think about fear in that moment. The only thought that mattered was, we survived together or not at all. Nearby, others were doing the same. Despite the pandemonium, acts of quiet heroism rippled through the crowd. People passed water, helped the weak, calmed the terrified, even when they themselves were seconds from death. In the water, the scene was no less harrowing. The Baltic in early May was icy, each wave a knife against skin already scraped by debris. Survivors clung to wooden planks, overturned lifeboats, or the corpses of others, desperate for anything that could keep them afloat. Many simply drowned from exhaustion or hypothermia, their bodies swallowed silently by the indifferent sea. Medical assistance was virtually non-existent. Those rescued by German soldiers or civilians often arrived too late, suffering burns, broken limbs, or radiation-like injuries from the extreme heat and fire.
The pilots, flying above, had no idea the human catastrophe unfolding beneath them. RAF Typhoons and Lancasters were executing a standard mission: neutralize enemy shipping to prevent troop movements or reinforce the collapsing Nazi war effort. They reported ships sunk, fires seen from the air, and enemy resistance. Little did they know that what they had targeted were not armed vessels, but floating prisons filled with people who had already endured the worst horrors of concentration camps. After the war, many of these pilots expressed horror when the truth became known. Some wrote letters that they never sent, haunted by the fact that their actions, intended as military necessity, had killed thousands of innocents. Meanwhile, aboard other ships in the flotilla, survivors were experiencing a similar nightmare. The Feelbeck, another vessel carrying Neuengamme prisoners, was also attacked and sunk. Flames consumed wooden decks, and smoke billowed like living walls, separating friends and families from one another. In the confined spaces below decks, many prisoners were trapped with no chance of escape. People suffocated or burned alive. Others leapt into the sea, only to find the icy waves unkind. Some tried to form chains, holding on to one another, hoping to survive together. The chaos was almost unimaginable, yet within it were flashes of resilience that defy description. One striking detail from survivor accounts is the way people tried to maintain dignity amidst the catastrophe. Women comforted children, men shielded the sick, and groups of prisoners sang softly, perhaps to keep panic at bay. A former inmate remembered a man lifting a frail elderly woman onto a lifeboat that was already overloaded. When she asked if he would be able to hold her, he simply smiled and said, "We go together." Moments like this, small and fleeting, offer glimpses of humanity amid a disaster so vast it defies comprehension. By the evening, both the Kappa Arcona and Feelbeck had largely sunk. Thousands were dead, but rescue efforts began almost immediately. German fishing boats, some commandeered civilian craft, and even a few military vessels pulled survivors from the freezing water. Doctors and nurses worked tirelessly, though their supplies were limited and the wounded staggering in number. In one account, a nurse described treating people whose skin had been burned to the point that it peeled off in sheets, whose lungs had inhaled smoke, and whose eyes were swollen shut. She wrote that the smells of burning flesh and salt water were seared into her memory forever. But even amidst this devastation, life began to assert itself. Survivors clung to whatever hope they could find. They sang songs, prayed, or simply held on to the hands of someone they didn't even know, drawing strength from shared suffering. These moments, however brief, remind us that the human spirit can persist
even in the most unimaginable conditions. In the aftermath, estimates of the death toll varied wildly. Early reports suggested upwards of 5,000 dead, but as historians pieced together accounts from survivors, German records, and British mission logs, the figure grew to more than 7,000 for the Kappa Arcona alone. When combined with the Thielbeck and other vessels, the total death toll likely exceeded 10,000. The scale of the disaster was staggering, yet overshadowed by other wartime tragedies. Unlike the sinking of the Titanic or Lusitania, the Kappa Arcona catastrophe was largely forgotten outside Germany, its victims almost invisible in the larger narrative of World War II. Historians have debated the intent behind the shipping of prisoners onto these vessels. Some argue that the Nazis intended to kill them, either by leaving them aboard to perish or by targeting them with Allied attacks. Others contend it was a chaotic evacuation, a desperate attempt to move prisoners away from advancing Allied forces without clear plans for their safety. Regardless of intent, the result was catastrophic. Thousands of people who had survived camps, forced labor, disease, and starvation were murdered by circumstance, error, or perhaps indifference. By May 1945, the war in Europe was effectively over. Germany surrendered on May 7th, but the Kappa Arcona survivors were left to navigate a post-war world filled with physical and emotional scars. Those rescued were often malnourished, traumatized, and ill. Rehabilitation was slow, and for many, the memory of the sinking haunted them for decades. Survivors reported nightmares, flashbacks, and an enduring fear of the sea itself, a place that had once promised freedom, but instead became a grave. Before we continue with the final part of this story, take a moment to subscribe if you haven't already. Hit the like button and share this video with someone who believes history is about the people, not just the events. The story of Kappa Arcona is a reminder of human fragility, resilience, and the unintended consequences of war, and it deserves to be remembered in every classroom and living room alike.
The sinking of the Cap Arcona wasn't just a maritime disaster. It was a collision of chaos, war, and human error on a scale almost impossible to comprehend. And yet, it also left us with stories of hope, stories of people who, against all odds, survived, helped each other, and bore witness to one of history's most tragic mistakes. In the days that followed the sinking of the Cap Arcona, the survivors faced a reality as cold and unforgiving as the Baltic waters that had nearly claimed them. Many were too weak to walk, their bodies emaciated from months, even years of starvation and forced labor in the concentration camps. Some had suffered injuries in the sinking, broken bones, burns, hypothermia. But the greatest burden was psychological. The horror they had witnessed, the screams, the faces of those who didn't make it, remained lodged in their minds, refusing to fade. The German civilians and soldiers who managed to rescue some of the survivors were overwhelmed. They did what they could, offering blankets, food, and shelter, but the scale of the tragedy was staggering. In Lübeck, hospitals were flooded with the sick and injured. Makeshift triage centers were established in churches and schools. Nurses worked in near constant motion, washing burns, bandaging wounds, and trying to provide comfort with words and gestures when medicine failed. One nurse later recounted holding the hand of a young woman who had lost her entire family in the sinking. She whispered, "You're safe now." I don't think she ever heard me, but I had to say it. The survivors' stories were harrowing. Some recalled seeing entire sections of the ship engulfed in flames in minutes. Others described trying to escape from holds filled with hundreds of people, suffocating from smoke, and the press of panicked bodies. There were those who floated for hours in the icy water, gripping pieces of wreckage, watching friends, strangers, even relatives disappear beneath the waves. And yet, despite it all, there were instances of extraordinary courage and selflessness. Strangers shared their meager supplies, comforted children, and risked their lives to save others. These acts of humanity in the face of unimaginable death stand as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. News of the disaster eventually reached Allied forces, but the full scale was not immediately understood. The RAF pilots who had attacked the ships had no idea that their target was filled with prisoners rather than armed military personnel. Their mission reports listed enemy vessels destroyed, but the human toll remained a hidden tragedy for months. It wasn't until survivor testimonies, combined with post-war investigations, that the shocking truth emerged. Thousands of prisoners, many of them weakened from the horrors of the concentration camps, had perished in what became one of the deadliest maritime disasters in history. Historians have since debated the intent behind the transport of prisoners on ships like the Cap Arcona. Some suggest it was a deliberate act to eliminate witnesses to the Nazi regime's crimes. Others argue that it was part of a chaotic, last-minute evacuation, poorly planned and executed, reflecting the disintegration of the Third Reich in its final days. Regardless of the reasoning, the outcome was catastrophic. Lives that had already survived the unimaginable were snatched away in a cruel twist of fate. By the summer of 1945, Germany was in ruins, and the survivors of Cap Arcona began the slow, painful process of rebuilding their lives. Many returned to towns and villages where their families had been lost, where homes had been destroyed, and where the very landscape of their world had changed forever. Others emigrated, seeking new beginnings in countries that would accept them. Across Europe, the tale of the Cap Arcona became a quiet testament to the chaos of the war's final days, a reminder that tragedy often hides in the shadows of history.
Yet, in these dark stories, there were threads of hope. Survivors formed communities, supported one another, and dedicated their lives to remembrance. Memorials were erected, names were inscribed, and the tragedy of the Cap Arcona began to occupy a place in historical memory, ensuring that the lives lost would not be forgotten. Some survivors devoted themselves to teaching future generations about the war's consequences, using their stories to promote peace and understanding, and to warn against the dangers of blind obedience and indifference to human suffering. One survivor, a man who had been in his 20s at the time, described the experience in simple yet haunting terms. "We were already ghosts when we boarded that ship, but the water reminded us that even ghosts can drown." His words capture the essence of the Cap Arcona tragedy, a convergence of human cruelty, error, and misfortune, leaving behind a legacy of pain, but also remarkable resilience. In reflecting on the sinking of the Cap Arcona, it's impossible not to recognize the stark contrasts between human capacity for both destruction and compassion. The ship was a floating stage upon which both horror and heroism played out simultaneously. For every life lost in flames or water, there were moments where individuals refused to let despair dominate, reaching out to help strangers, holding children, offering solace. These small gestures of humanity shine brightly against the backdrop of such a profound catastrophe. Before we close this story, if you've been moved even slightly by the courage, resilience, and memory of those who survived, subscribe to the channel. Hit the like button and share this video with someone who values history told with heart and humanity. Stories like the Cap Arconas remind us that history is not just about events, but about the people who lived through them. Even today, the waters of the Baltic carry echoes of that terrible day. Divers have explored the wreck, finding remnants of the ship, fragments of personal belongings, and traces of the lives abruptly ended. Museums in Germany preserve photos, letters, and oral histories, allowing visitors to bear witness to the suffering and endurance of the survivors. These memorials stand not only as reminders of tragedy, but as a testament to the human spirit's determination to survive, remember, and teach. The sinking of the Cap Arcona is not just a footnote in the history of World War II. It is a profound example of how chaos, misjudgment, and cruelty can collide, and yet how resilience and humanity can persist. The survivors, through their testimony and courage, ensure that the events are not forgotten. Their stories continue to educate, to warn, and to inspire. In the end, what remains is memory and reflection. The Cap Arcona is underwater now, its physical form claimed by the sea. But the legacy of the people aboard, their suffering, their bravery, their final acts of compassion, lives on. Each life lost reminds us of the fragility of human existence and the enduring strength of human connection, even in the darkest of times. And so, as the sun rises over the Baltic, glinting on the water where the Cap Arcona rests, we remember the lives lost, the courage displayed, and the unyielding human spirit that, even in tragedy, refuses to be extinguished. The story of the Cap Arcona teaches us that history is not merely events and dates, but the echo of human hearts beating against the tides of catastrophe. It is that human spirit, enduring, resilient, and luminous, that we honor as we recount these stories, making sure that the lessons and the memories are never lost.